From the outside, Anna's marriage to Michael was a portrait of quiet contentment. He was a man carved from steadiness and respect, his love a constant, gentle hum in the background of her life. He was a restorer of antique furniture, a man whose hands possessed a language of their own. Anna would watch him for hours in his workshop at the back of their small house, mesmerized by the way he'd handle a piece of fractured, forgotten wood. His touch was reverent, patient, almost intimate. He'd trace the grain of a splintered tabletop as if reading a story etched in the timber, his fingers knowing just how much pressure to apply, where to sand away the damage of time, and where to let the scars remain as part of its history. He treated everything in his world with that same careful reverence, the wilting orchid on the kitchen windowsill that he'd coax back to life with measured drops of water, the stray cat he'd feed on the back porch with slow, unthreatening movements, the worn pages of his favorite books that he turned with a respect for the words within. Everything in his life received the full, focused grace of his hands. Everything, except for her. With Anna, his hands became strangers. They were hesitant, weightless, and achingly polite. A quick, dutiful kiss at the door before he left for the workshop was as light as a falling leaf, a brief brush of lips that never lingered. When he took her hand as they walked through town, it was a polite, airy clasp, a gesture of ownership with no true possession. In their shared bed at night, he would lie beside her, a warm and steady presence whose even breathing filled the silence, but his touch, when it came, was so cautious it felt like an apology. It was the touch of a man afraid to leave a fingerprint on a priceless piece of glass, when all she wanted was to be held like solid, sturdy oak. She ached for his touch. Not just any touch, but that touch. The one he gave the rest of the world so freely. She watched him one afternoon, restoring a delicate, inlaid music box, and felt a pang of jealousy so sharp it stole her breath. She wanted him to trace the line of her jaw with that same intense focus. She yearned for him to hold her with the same confident strength he used to steady a wobbly chair leg, knowing he could mend whatever was broken. She was the one thing in his life he had promised to cherish forever, yet she felt like the only thing he was afraid to truly handle. The question echoed in the quietest corners of her heart, a whisper that grew louder each night. Was she simply not the kind of material he knew how to work with? Was she too soft, too complex, too easily broken in his eyes? She loved this kind, constant, good man with every fiber of her being. She loved his quiet intelligence, his unwavering loyalty, and the gentle peace he brought into her life. But love without expression was beginning to feel like a beautiful, empty room, and she was starting to wonder if she would ever feel truly at home in her own marriage, in her own skin, beside the man who could restore anything but the connection between them. She was a guest in her own love story, and she didn't know how much longer she could bear the silence of his hands. Chapter 2, The Language of the Doe. It happened on a Thursday. A day heavy with unspoken tension after a small, silly disagreement that morning over something as trivial as a misplaced bill. The words had been nothing, but the silence that followed was immense. Anna felt raw, restless, her insides a tangled knot of frustration and longing. To burn off the feeling, she decided to bake bread, an act that usually soothed her with its methodical rhythm. But today, there was no rhythm, only chaos. She attacked the dough on the floured countertop, not with the gentle patience it required, but with a sharp, angry energy. She punched it down, kneaded it too aggressively, her movements clumsy and harsh. Flour dusted her cheeks like angry tears, and her hair kept falling into her eyes. The dough was a sticky, uncooperative mess, refusing to come together, a perfect reflection of how she felt inside, formless and falling apart. She didn't hear Michael enter the kitchen. The floorboards in their old house usually announced his every move, but this time he was simply there, his presence a sudden, warm stillness at her back. He didn't speak. He didn't ask what was wrong or comment on the flour-covered disaster zone she had created. He just watched her struggle for a moment, his gaze taking in her tense shoulders, her clenched jaw, the furious way her hands fought against the very thing she was trying to create. Then, he moved. He came up behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, and gently, firmly, placed his large, capable hands over hers on the dough. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It wasn't an apology for the morning's argument. It was the gesture of a master craftsman guiding an apprentice, an act of pure, focused intention. "You're fighting it," he said, his voice a low rumble near her ear that vibrated through her entire body. You have to listen to it. Feel what it needs. His hands, firm and knowing, began to move with hers. He didn't take over, he included her. He guided her palms, showing her how to push and fold in a rhythmic, rocking motion, how to use the weight of her body, not just the force of her arms. Under his touch, under his quiet guidance, the sticky, chaotic mess began to transform. It became smooth, elastic, alive. Anna's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the touch she had craved. Confident, patient, present. For the first time, she was not the fragile object to be handled with care. She was part of the creation, strong and capable under his guidance. The kitchen was silent save for the soft sigh of the dough as it yielded. The scent of yeast and flour and the clean, woody smell of his skin filled the air. When the dough was finally perfect, a smooth, warm ball of potential, his hands stilled over hers. But he didn't pull away. The task was done, but the connection remained. Slowly, deliberately, he turned her flour-dusted hand over in his. His thumb began to trace the lines on her palm, gently at first, then with the focused, reverent pressure she had only ever seen him give to wood and stone. He wasn't fixing her or guiding her anymore. He was simply learning her. His eyes met hers in the reflection of the dark kitchen window, and in their depths, she saw not just kindness, but a flicker of something new. Awe. And a profound, unspoken apology. That night in the kitchen, he said nothing more, but his hands had finally started a conversation she had been waiting a lifetime to hear. Chapter 3. The Echo of a Touch. The morning after the night in the kitchen, the air in the house was different. It wasn't a loud change, but a subtle shift in the quality of the silence between them. The heavy, empty quiet had been replaced by a soft, humming stillness, one filled with the echo of a touch. Anna woke before Michael, her hand still tingling with the memory of his thumb tracing her palm. She watched him sleep, the stern concentration he wore in his workshop smoothed away, revealing a vulnerability she rarely saw. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the familiar ache of loneliness beside him. She felt hopeful. Things weren't magically fixed. The breakfast they shared was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. When he passed her the jar of jam, his fingers brushed against hers, and for a fraction of a second they lingered. He met her eyes, a question in his, and she gave him a small, shy smile in return. It was a tiny moment, almost nothing, but it felt like everything. It was a confirmation that she hadn't imagined it, that the bridge he had started to build with his hands the night before was still there. Later that day, Anna went into town to run errands. She sat in a small cafe, nursing a cup of tea, and found herself observing the other people around her. At a nearby table, a young couple was deep in conversation. The man wasn't doing anything overtly romantic, but as he spoke, he unconsciously toyed with his girlfriend's fingers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. It was a gesture of casual, confident intimacy, the kind of touch that says, "You are a part of me." A few months ago, seeing that would have sent a sharp pang of envy through her. Today, it sparked a flicker of recognition. It was the same reverent touch Michael had given her hand. She realized she had been so focused on the lack of touch in her marriage that she hadn't considered the possibility that Michael simply didn't know how. It wasn't a language he was fluent in. The kitchen had been a lesson, a first word spoken after a lifetime of silence. When she returned home, she found him in the living room, a book open on his lap, though he wasn't reading. He was just staring at the wall, lost in thought. She came and sat beside him on the couch, leaving a careful foot of space between them. "I was thinking," he said, his voice quiet, not looking at her. "About last night. About the bread." Anna's heart did a little flip. "Me too." I'm sorry," he said, and the words sounded rusty, as if they hadn't been used in a long time. "I'm sorry it took me so long to show up." "You've always been here, Michael," she replied softly. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful honesty. "No, I haven't. Not really. I've been standing on the sidelines, watching. Afraid to join in." He hesitated, then reached out, not for her hand, but to gently tuck a stray piece of her hair behind her ear. His fingers grazed her temple, a feather-light touch, but it was deliberate. It was an offering. "I don't want to be on the sidelines anymore, Anna. I don't know where to start." His confession was a key, unlocking a part of her heart that had been guarded by confusion and hurt. The frustration she had harbored for so long melted away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming compassion. He wasn't distant, he was lost. And for the first time, he was asking for a map. She closed the distance between them on the couch, took his large, calloused hand in both of hers, and brought it to her lips, pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. "You start here," she whispered. "You just start here." Chapter 4. The Workshop Confession. A few days later, a fragile new rhythm began to establish itself in their home. It was a rhythm of small, deliberate gestures. A hand on her lower back as she reached for something on a high shelf, a brush of his arm against hers as they passed in the hallway. Each touch was a quiet question, a test of the waters, and Anna answered every time with a soft smile or a gentle lean into his presence, signaling that the waters were safe. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, he asked her to come out to the workshop. This was unusual. His workshop was his sanctuary, a sacred space where he communed with wood and memory. She rarely entered unless invited. The air inside was thick with the rich, comforting scent of sawdust, linseed oil, and old timber. In the center of the room, illuminated by the warm glow of a single overhead lamp, sat a half-finished rocking cradle, its curved runners smooth and perfect. He had been working on it for a friend's new baby. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his hands moving over the unfinished wood, feeling for imperfections she couldn't see. "My father," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, he wasn't a gentle man. His hands were for fixing engines and for discipline. They were strong. They were useful. But they weren't kind. He paused, picking up a piece of fine-grit sandpaper and running it along the edge of the cradle's headboard. "Affection. That was my mother's job, and she was always too tired for it. The only time he ever touched me with anything other than purpose was when he was angry." Anna stood silently, her heart aching for the little boy he must have been. She finally understood. His fear wasn't of her, it was of himself. "I learned early that a man's touch could be clumsy," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "That it could hurt things without meaning to. That it could leave marks. When I met you, Anna, you were the most beautiful, intricate thing I had ever seen. You were like this." He gestured to a delicate piece of lacquered inlay on his workbench. "Perfect and whole. I was so terrified of leaving a scratch, of handling you the wrong way, of my own clumsiness breaking you, that it felt safer not to handle you at all." Tears welled in Anna's eyes, blurring the warm light of the workshop. All this time, she had made his silence about her own desirability, her own worth. She had thought she wasn't enough, when the truth was, he felt he was too much, too rough, too coarse, too dangerous for something as precious as her. She walked over to him, her footsteps soft on the wood-shaving dusted floor. She gently took the sandpaper from his hand and set it aside. Then she took his hand, the one that had built their bookshelves, fixed their leaking faucet, and crafted such beauty from broken things, and placed it flat against her cheek. It was warm, calloused, and strong. It felt like home. "You could never break me, Michael," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. She leaned into his palm, a silent act of total trust. But the silence was starting to. "Your silence was the only thing that ever hurt." He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path through the sawdust on his cheek. He didn't pull his hand away. For the first time, he simply let it rest there, feeling the warmth of her skin, the delicate strength of her, and finally perhaps the gentleness in himself. Chapter 5. An Invitation to Feel. The confession in the workshop was not an ending, but a true beginning. It was as if a heavy, invisible weight had been lifted from the air between them. Michael's fear, once a silent, shadowy barrier, was now out in the open, and in naming it, they had taken away its power. Anna's heart, no longer bruised by misunderstanding, was filled with a fierce, protective tenderness. She saw him now not as a distant husband, but as a man longing to connect, a man who just needed to be shown the way. That night, the atmosphere in their home was charged with a soft, hopeful electricity. After they had cleaned up from dinner, a comfortable quiet settled over them. In the past, this quiet would have stretched into a long evening of them existing in separate orbits, her reading on the couch, him retreating to his workshop. But tonight, Anna knew she couldn't let the old patterns take hold. She took a deep breath, walked over to where he stood by the window, and gently took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it was a deliberate invitation. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her, his eyes full of a raw vulnerability. "Come with me," she whispered. She didn't lead him to the bedroom with an air of demand or expectation. Her touch was gentle, her pace unhurried. It was an offering, not a request. She led him into their room and closed the door, shutting out the rest of the world. In the soft glow of the bedside lamp, she turned to face him. She didn't begin with a kiss. Instead, she lifted his hands, the ones he believed to be so clumsy and dangerous, and held them in front of her. She studied them, the calloused palms, the slightly crooked finger from an old injury, the faint tracing of wood stain under his nails. To her, they weren't instruments of harm, they were the hands that had built their life. She brought his right hand to her lips and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his scarred knuckles. "These hands," she murmured against his skin, "fixed the back porch step so I wouldn't trip." She kissed his palm. "These hands planted the gardenias outside my window because they know I love the smell." She turned his hand over and kissed the sensitive skin of his wrist. "These hands have never, ever hurt me." Michael's breath hitched, and she could feel a tremor run through him. He was a man unmade and remade by this simple act of grace. Slowly, she began to undress him, her movements fluid and confident. With each button she unfastened, with each layer she peeled away, it felt as if she were unwrapping a precious gift that had been kept hidden for too long. When he stood before her, beautifully, vulnerably bare, she took his hands again and placed them on her waist. "It's okay," she whispered, her eyes holding his. "Just be here with me." That night, for the first time, he made love to her not like a man afraid of breaking something precious, but like a craftsman finally brave enough to worship his creation. His touch was still hesitant at times, but it was no longer born of fear. It was born of awe. He explored her with a focused reverence, learning the curves of her body, the rhythm of her breathing, the sounds of her pleasure. And Anna, in turn, gave herself over completely, her own responses a silent language of encouragement, assuring him with every sigh and every caress that he was not clumsy, he was not dangerous. He was home. Chapter 6. The morning after. Anna woke the next morning to an empty space beside her. The sun was just beginning to cast a soft, pearly light into the room, and the sheets where Michael had been were still warm. For a panicked moment, the old familiar ache of absence clenched in her stomach. Had she dreamed it all? Had the vulnerability of the night been too much, causing him to retreat back into the safety of his silence? She pushed the thought away, held onto the memory of his touch, and swung her legs out of bed. She found him where she suspected she would, in his workshop. He was standing at his workbench, his back to her, a block of unsculpted maple held between his hands. He wasn't carving or sanding. He was just holding it, his knuckles white. He was fully dressed, and the quiet tension in his shoulders was a language she knew all too well. He had retreated. Her first instinct was to feel the sting of rejection, to let the disappointment settle in like a cold frost. But then she remembered the look in his eyes the night before, the raw fear mixed with awe. This wasn't a rejection of her, this was him grappling with the aftershock of his own emotional earthquake. He had let go of a fear he had carried his entire life, and the resulting emptiness was likely as terrifying as the fear itself. She didn't speak. She walked quietly over to the small hot plate in the corner where he sometimes made coffee and began to prepare 2 mugs. The familiar, comforting scent of brewing coffee filled the space. When it was ready, she carried a mug over to him and placed it on the bench beside his hand. He didn't look up, but his shoulders relaxed a fraction. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Me neither," she lied softly. He finally set the block of wood down and wrapped his hands around the warm mug, as if needing to anchor himself to something solid. "Last night," he started, then trailed off, unable to find the words. "Last night was beautiful," Anna finished for him, her voice gentle and free of expectation. He shook his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the swirling steam from his coffee. "It was a lot. I'm not used to feeling that much. It's like I've been living in a house with all the windows painted black, and you just scraped the paint off one of them. The light is blinding." Anna's heart swelled with understanding. He wasn't pushing her away. He was adjusting to the light. She moved to stand beside him, not touching him, but closing the physical distance between them. She leaned her shoulder against his, a simple, warm point of contact. "You don't have to get used to it all at once," she said. "We can let the light in one window at a time." He was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee. Then, he slowly, tentatively, reached out his free hand and let it rest on the small of her back. It was a simple touch, nothing like the passionate exploration of the night before, but in the quiet morning light of the workshop, it felt even more profound. It wasn't a gesture of desire, it was a gesture of presence. It said, "I'm still here. I'm scared, but I'm not running away." She leaned into his touch, a silent reassurance. They stood like that for a long time, side by side, watching the sunrise paint the sky outside the workshop window. The intimacy of the previous night hadn't been a fleeting moment. It had laid a new foundation, one strong enough to hold the weight of a man's fear and a woman's patient love. The silence in the workshop wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the quiet work of two souls learning to live in the light. Chapter 7, A New Vocabulary. The real change began not in the bedroom, but in the small, sunlit spaces of their daily lives. Having acknowledged the fear, Michael seemed determined to build a new vocabulary of touch, and Anna became his willing partner in learning this unspoken language. It was a slow and often clumsy process, a series of small, intentional acts that began to rethread the fabric of their marriage. It started with his hands finding reasons to be near her. One afternoon, while she was at the kitchen counter writing a grocery list, he came to stand beside her to get a glass of water. As he reached for the faucet, the back of his hand brushed against her arm. In the past, he would have recoiled instantly, as if from an electric shock. This time, he let it linger for a beat too long, a warm, deliberate pressure. Anna paused her writing, a small smile playing on her lips. It was a silent question, and she answered by leaning into the touch ever so slightly. He grew bolder. A few days later, they were at the local farmer's market, navigating the bustling crowd. Anna was inspecting a carton of strawberries when she felt his hand on her lower back, a steady, guiding pressure that was both protective and possessive. Her breath caught. It was such a simple, common gesture between couples, but for them, it was a milestone. Later, as they walked home, their canvas bags heavy with produce, he reached for her hand. It wasn't the light, polite clasp of before. He laced his fingers through hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand with a gentle, rhythmic motion. It was the touch of a man who was not just holding her hand, but holding her. Anna felt a thrill of pure joy, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She was his wife, and for the first time in public, she truly felt like it. He began to integrate touch into his affection. He would come up behind her while she was watering her plants and press a soft kiss to her shoulder, his hand resting on her waist. Once, she brought him a cup of tea in the workshop. He was deeply focused on a delicate repair, his brow furrowed in concentration. He stopped his work, looked at her with a gratitude that went beyond the simple offering of tea, and pulled her onto his lap. He didn't kiss her or say anything. He just held her for a full minute, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in as if she were the very scent of peace. The moment was so unexpected, so deeply tender, that it brought tears to Anna's eyes. She, in turn, learned to be receptive, to create a safe harbor for his tentative explorations. She never flinched or acted surprised, even when his touch was a little awkward or his timing a little off. She simply accepted every gesture as the gift it was. Her positive reinforcement, a contented sigh, a soft smile, a returning touch, was the encouragement he needed to continue. They were building a bridge between them, one small, steady stone at a time, and with each new touch, the chasm of their past silence grew blessedly smaller. Chapter 8, The Ghost of the Past. The foundation of their new intimacy felt strong, but they had not yet tested it against the ghosts of Michael's past. That test came on a Tuesday evening in the form of a phone call. Anna was in the living room reading, when she heard the low murmur of Michael's voice from the kitchen. It was his father. The calls were infrequent and always brief, clipped conversations that left Michael quiet and withdrawn for hours afterward. This time was no different. When he emerged from the kitchen, the light in his eyes had dimmed. The open, present man of the past few weeks was gone, replaced by a shadow of the person he used to be. A wall had gone up, swift and silent. He didn't mention the call, just picked up a book and sat in his armchair, the space between them suddenly feeling like a mile-wide canyon. Later, as they got ready for bed, the old silence returned, heavy and suffocating. He moved around the room with a careful, contained energy, avoiding her gaze. When he finally slipped under the covers, he lay stiffly on his side of the bed, his back a rigid barrier. A cold panic seized Anna. Had it all been a dream? Was their new connection so fragile that a single phone call could shatter it? The old hurt, the familiar feeling of being unwanted, pricked at the edges of her heart. Her first instinct was to retreat into her own shell, to match his silence with her own, to protect herself from the pain of his withdrawal. But then she looked at the tense line of his shoulders, and she remembered his confession in the workshop. This wasn't about her. This was about a little boy who had learned that a man's hands were for discipline. His father's voice had not just echoed through the phone line, it had echoed through the decades, reminding him of who he used to be, and making him forget the man he was becoming. She took a deep, steadying breath, pushing aside her own hurt. She wouldn't let the ghost win. She rolled onto her side to face his back. She didn't press him to talk or demand to know what was wrong. Instead, she reached out and laid her hand gently on his shoulder. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of muscle. She didn't pull away. She just kept her hand there, a warm, steady point of contact. "I'm here," she whispered into the darkness. She didn't expect a response, and for a long time, she didn't get one. She could feel the battle raging within him, the old conditioning fighting against the new trust. She held her ground, her hand a silent testament to her patience. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a long, shuddering breath and rolled over to face her. In the dim moonlight, she could see the sheen of unshed tears in his eyes. "He makes me feel," Michael's voice was hoarse, "like I'm made of stone. Like I'm clumsy and cold, and I'll break everything I touch." "You're not stone, Michael," she said, her voice fierce with love. She took his hand, the one he believed to be so harsh, and brought it to her heart. "You're the furthest thing from it." He didn't speak again, but he laced his fingers through hers, his grip tight and grounding. He didn't try to kiss her or initiate any further intimacy. He just held her hand, and they lay there, face to face in the quiet darkness. The ghost had come to visit, but this time, it had not found them alone. They had faced it together, and their fragile new foundation had held. Chapter 9: Playfulness and Discovery. Having weathered their first storm, a new season began to dawn in their relationship. The careful, almost reverent exploration of touch began to give way to something lighter, more joyful, playfulness. The heavy weight of healing was lifting, and in its place, a sense of discovery and delight began to bloom. They had built a foundation of trust, and now they were free to build a house of joy upon it. It started on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Trapped inside by the relentless downpour, they had fallen into their old patterns. Anna reading on the couch, Michael sketching in his notebook. The silence was comfortable now, but it was still silence. Suddenly, Anna put her book down. She walked over to their small record player, put on an old, crackling vinyl of a soul singer, and turned the volume up just a little too loud. She walked over to Michael, a mischievous glint in her eye, and held out her hand. "Dance with me," she said. He looked up, startled, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "Anna, I don't dance." "Neither do I," she laughed. "That's what makes it fun." He hesitated for a moment, the old shyness warring with the new man he was becoming. But her smile was infectious, her invitation genuine. He sighed, a smile tugging at his own lips, and took her hand. What followed was not a dance, but a clumsy, wonderful shuffle around the living room. He was stiff at first, his movements awkward, but Anna's laughter was a balm. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and soon he was laughing too, spinning her in a slightly off-balance circle. It was silly and imperfect, full of bumped knees and missed beats, but it was also full of touch and breath and shared, unadulterated joy. This newfound playfulness began to seep into their intimacy. The bedroom was no longer a space solely for quiet reverence or healing, it became a place of exploration and shared pleasure. Michael's curiosity, once directed only at his craft, was now turned fully towards her. He was no longer just a passive recipient of her guidance. He was an active, eager student of her body. One night, he surprised her by lighting candles all over the room, not for romance but for light. "I want to see you," he said, his voice soft but confident. He spent an hour just looking at her, touching her, his hands and lips exploring her with a craftsman's attention to detail. He began to ask questions, his voice a low murmur in the flickering light. "Show me what you like," he'd whisper. "Tell me what you're feeling." These questions were the ultimate act of trust. He was no longer afraid of doing it wrong, he was excited about learning how to do it right for her. For Anna, this was a revelation. His desire to please her was the most profound aphrodisiac she had ever known. She felt a new sense of freedom and confidence bloom within her. She was no longer just the patient teacher, she was an equal partner in a thrilling adventure. Their lovemaking became a conversation, a give and take of sighs and whispers and laughter. They were creating their own language, one built not on past hurts, but on present joys. They were building a shared history of pleasure to overlay the old history of silence, and Anna knew, with every fiber of her being, that this was the love she had been waiting for all her life. Chapter 10. The Unspoken Future. The cradle Michael had been working on was finally finished. It was a masterpiece of cherry wood, sanded so smooth it felt like water-worn stone, its rockers perfectly balanced to create a gentle, soothing motion. He had delivered it to their friends, Mark and Sarah, the week before, and now they were invited over to meet the new arrival. Anna was a little nervous. The idea of a baby, of a family, had always felt like a distant, hazy dream. In the early days of her marriage, it was a dream she had pushed away, believing it would be unfair to bring a child into a home so filled with silence and a lack of physical affection. Now, things were different, but the thought still felt fragile, momentous. They walked into their friend's home, a place filled with the chaotic, beautiful mess of new parenthood. Sarah was exhausted but radiant, and Mark was a doting, if slightly overwhelmed father. And there, in the center of the living room, was the cradle, and nestled inside it, a tiny, sleeping baby boy named Leo. Anna watched as Sarah gently lifted her son and offered him to Michael. A flicker of the old panic crossed Anna's face. She held her breath, expecting to see Michael's familiar hesitation, the fear of holding something so small and precious. But it never came. Michael took the baby into his arms with a natural, gentle confidence that stunned her. His large, calloused hands, the ones he had once believed to be so clumsy, formed a perfect, secure cradle. He held the infant against his chest, his movements sure and steady as he began to rock back and forth. The baby, who had started to stir, settled instantly, calmed by the steady rhythm of Michael's heartbeat. A profound, soul-deep love washed over Anna as she watched him. He looked up and met her gaze over the baby's downy head, and in his eyes, she saw not fear, but a quiet, overwhelming wonder. He was not the man his father had been. He was the man he had built himself to be, gentle, strong, and unafraid to love. Later that night, as they lay in their own quiet home, the image of Michael holding the baby was burned into her mind. The idea of a child, which had once felt so complicated, now felt simple, right? "You were so good with him," she said softly into the darkness. She felt him smile against her hair. "He's a lot less complicated than an 18th century writing desk." She laughed, then grew quiet. "Michael, have you ever thought about it? About us having a family?" He was silent for a moment, and she felt a flicker of the old fear. Had she pushed too soon? But when he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "I never let myself," he confessed. "I was afraid. I didn't want to be the kind of father my dad was. I didn't think I had the right kind of touch for a child." He paused, then shifted, turning to face her. He took her hand and placed it on his chest, right over his heart. "But then you taught me that my hands weren't what I thought they were." Anna's heart felt too big for her chest. "You have the kindest hands I know," she whispered. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was different from all the others. It was no longer just about passion or healing or discovery. It was imbued with a sense of reverence, of hope, of an unspoken shared dream. That night, when they made love, it was an act of profound trust, a quiet, mutual decision. It was the sealing of a promise, not just to each other, but to the future they were finally brave enough to build together. Chapter 11. The Seed of Hope. The decision to start a family wasn't a single conversation, but a quiet, seismic shift in the landscape of their marriage. The idea, once a distant and terrifying mountain range, was now a warm, sunlit valley they could walk into together. The unspoken future had been spoken, and the speaking of it had made it real. Their intimacy, which had blossomed into a beautiful language of its own, took on a new layer of meaning. Every touch, every kiss, was now imbued with a sense of creation, of possibility. The act of love was no longer just about the two of them, it was an invitation to a third soul, a whispered prayer for a life to begin. This shared purpose brought with it a profound sense of unity, but also a quiet, fragile vulnerability. The first month passed with a silent, hopeful anticipation. Anna found herself paying hyper-attention to her body, interpreting every twinge and every wave of fatigue as a potential sign. When her period arrived, exactly on time, she felt a sharp, surprisingly deep pang of disappointment. She hid it well, flushing the evidence and stepping out of the bathroom with a smile plastered on her face. Michael was in the kitchen, making coffee, and he knew instantly. He didn't have to see the evidence, he saw it in the slight dimming of the light in her eyes, in the forced brightness of her smile. He set down his mug, walked over to her, and wrapped her in his arms. He didn't say, "It's okay," or "We'll try again." He just held her, his hand stroking her hair, offering the silent, solid comfort that had become his signature. "I know," he murmured against her temple. "I feel it too." His simple admission was a balm to her soul. She hadn't realized she was carrying the weight of the hope and the disappointment, all by herself. In his arms, she let herself feel the sadness without shame. They were in this together, in the wanting as much as in the waiting. The next month was different. They didn't speak of it as much, but the hope was a constant, gentle hum beneath the surface of their days. One afternoon, Anna was in the garden, weeding her small vegetable patch. A wave of dizziness washed over her, so strong she had to sit back on her heels, the world tilting slightly. It passed as quickly as it came, but it left behind a fluttering in her stomach that felt different from anything she had ever experienced. She didn't tell Michael. She held the fragile secret close, not wanting to get his hopes up, or her own. For a week, she lived in a state of quiet observation, cataloguing the subtle changes in her body, a new sensitivity to smells, a profound bone-deep weariness in the afternoons, a strange metallic taste in her mouth. Finally, she bought a test. She took it in the early morning, while Michael was still asleep, the house quiet and still. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, watching the little window, her heart hammering against her ribs. When the second pink line appeared, faint but undeniable, she felt the world stop. Awe, terror, and a joy so immense it felt like it might break her open, all washed over her at once. She didn't wake him up right away. She crept back into their bedroom and just watched him sleep, this good, kind man who had been so afraid of his own touch. This man who was going to be a father. She thought of his confession in the workshop, of his gentle hands on the baby cradle, of his steadfast comfort through their first disappointment. She got the small, carved cherry box he had made for her, the one filled with the engraved river stones. She took out a blank one she had saved and, with a permanent marker, carefully wrote a single word on its smooth surface, "Soon." She placed the stone in his palm as he slept. When he finally stirred, his fingers curled around it instinctively. He opened his eyes, blinked sleepily at her, and then looked down at his hand. He uncurled his fingers and stared at the stone, his brow furrowed in confusion for a moment. Then, his eyes widened, and he looked at her, a silent, breathtaking question in his gaze. Anna just smiled, tears streaming down her face, and nodded. The craftsman was about to embark on his most important creation yet. Chapter 12. The Craftsman and the Cradle. The news of the pregnancy settled into their home like a soft, warm light, illuminating every corner with a new sense of purpose. Michael, a man who had spent his life restoring the past, was now completely captivated by the future. The abstract idea of a baby, once a source of deep-seated fear, became a tangible, miraculous reality he could prepare for. And he prepared in the only way he knew how, with his hands. He decided that their child would not sleep in a store-bought crib. It would sleep in a cradle of his own making, a piece imbued with his love, his hope, and his newfound confidence. He cleared the center of his workshop, laying out the plans with the precision of an architect. He chose the wood with the reverence of a priest selecting a sacred text, a piece of solid, golden oak, its grain straight and true, a wood known for its strength and endurance. Anna would often come and sit in the workshop, watching him work. It became their new ritual. He would plane the wood, the long, curling shavings falling to the floor like wooden ribbons, the scent of fresh-cut oak filling the air. He didn't speak much as he worked, but he didn't need to. His focus, his dedication, the sheer joy he took in the creation, was a love letter written in sawdust and sweat. He was different in the workshop now. The space that had once been a refuge from a world he didn't know how to touch was now a place of joyful creation for the family he was building. He would talk to the baby as he worked, his voice a low, rumbling murmur against the backdrop of sanding and sawing. "This will be where you sleep," he'd say, running his hand over the smooth, curved rocker. "Strong and steady. I'll make sure you're always safe." Watching him, Anna fell in love with him all over again, but in a new, deeper way. She was in love with the father he was becoming. His hands, which she had once yearned for, were now not just hers, but theirs. They were the hands that would build their child's first bed, the hands that would one day hold their baby, the hands that would teach their son or daughter how to be both strong and gentle. As Anna's body began to change, Michael's touch changed with it. He was fascinated by her growing belly. He would trace its curve with his fingertips, a look of pure wonder on his face. Every evening, he would kneel before her, his hands spread gently over her stomach, waiting for the flutter of movement. The first time he felt the baby kick against his palm, his gasp was audible. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a joy so profound it was almost painful. "Hello in there," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. His hands, which had learned the language of her body, now learned the language of their child's. He was no longer afraid of his own strength. He knew, instinctively, how to be gentle. He would massage her swollen ankles, rub the ache from her lower back, and hold her at night when she couldn't get comfortable. His touch was no longer just about desire or healing, it was about care. It was the unwavering, steadfast touch of a protector, a partner, a father. One late afternoon, Anna came into the workshop to find him putting the final touches on the cradle. It was finished. It was more beautiful than she could have imagined, simple, elegant, and perfect. The oak glowed with a warm, hand-rubbed oil finish. On the headboard, so small you would miss it if you weren't looking, he had carved two intertwined letters, A and M. And nestled between them, a tiny, budding leaf. He stood back, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow, his expression a mixture of pride and humility. "It's ready," he said softly. Anna walked over and ran her hand over the impossibly smooth wood. She looked from the perfect cradle to the man who had built it, the man who had rebuilt himself. "It's more than ready," she said, her voice filled with love. "So are you." Chapter 13, A Different Kind of Touch. As the pregnancy progressed into its final trimester, a new kind of intimacy settled between them, one born of shared vulnerability and profound physical change. Anna's body, once a familiar landscape, was now a territory of constant transformation. She felt beautiful and powerful, but also clumsy, exhausted, and often uncomfortable. The easy sensuality they had discovered was replaced by a different kind of closeness, one that was less about passion and more about pure, unadorned care. Michael, who had learned the language of her pleasure, now had to learn the language of her discomfort. And he did so with a grace and attentiveness that moved her to tears. He became an expert in the geography of her aches and pains. He knew just how to stack the pillows to support her belly and her back at night. He learned to massage the persistent ache in her hips with the same focused pressure he used to work a knot out of a piece of wood. His touch was no longer about discovery or playfulness, it was about support, both literally and figuratively. When she struggled to tie her shoes, his hands were there. When she got breathless climbing the stairs, his arm was a steady presence around her waist. He had once been afraid to handle her for fear of breaking her. Now he held her together when she felt like she was falling apart. One humid evening, Anna was feeling particularly overwhelmed. She was swollen, tired, and her skin felt stretched and tight. She stood in front of the mirror, looking at her reflection, and for the first time, felt a sense of alienation from her own body. She didn't feel radiant or glowing, she just felt large and unwieldy. Michael came into the bedroom and saw the look on her face. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her she was beautiful. He understood that this was a moment beyond words. He disappeared for a moment and came back with a small bottle of the almond oil he used to finish his most delicate projects, and a soft towel. "Come," he said gently. "Sit down." He had her sit on the edge of the bed, and he knelt before her. He warmed the oil in his hands, those strong, calloused hands, and began to gently massage her swollen feet and ankles. His touch was slow, methodical, and incredibly soothing. He worked his way up her calves, his thumbs pressing into the tight muscles, easing the tension with a craftsman's skill. He didn't speak. The only sounds in the room were the soft slide of his hands on her skin and her own quiet, grateful breaths. When he reached her belly, his touch became even more reverent. He spread the warm oil over the taut skin, his hands moving in slow, circular motions. It wasn't a sensual touch, nor was it merely clinical. It was an act of pure worship, of honoring the incredible work her body was doing. He was tending to her, to their child, to the vessel that held their future. Tears welled in Anna's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness or discomfort, but of overwhelming love and gratitude. He had seen her unspoken insecurity and had met it not with words, but with an act of profound, tangible care. He had reconnected her to her own body through the simple, selfless power of his touch. He looked up and saw her tears. He paused, his hands still warm on her belly. "What is it?" he asked, his voice full of concern. She shook her head, a watery smile on her lips. "Nothing," she whispered. "It's just everything." He had learned to love her with his hands, and in doing so, he had taught her how to love the parts of herself she was struggling with. In that quiet lamplit room, their love was not a fiery passion, but a deep, steady, and unconditional presence. Chapter 14. The Final Quiet. The last few weeks of the pregnancy were a strange, suspended time. It was a period of intense waiting, of living on the precipice of a monumental change. The cradle stood in the corner of their bedroom, a silent, beautiful promise. The small bag they had packed for the hospital sat by the door, a constant reminder of the imminent journey. The world seemed to hold its breath, and in that shared anticipation, Anna and Michael found a new level of quiet companionship. They spent their evenings close, often just sitting on the couch, her feet in his lap. Sometimes they would talk, speculating on who the baby would look like, what their personality might be. Other times, they would be silent, content in each other's presence, his hand resting on her belly, a three-way conversation happening without a single word. During this time, Anna saw a new side of Michael emerge. He had always been a man of quiet routines, but now his routines were all centered around her and the baby. He would wake early to make her a specific herbal tea that was meant to help with labor. He read books on childbirth and fatherhood with the same intensity he usually reserved for woodworking manuals, highlighting passages and leaving notes in the margins. One afternoon, he came to her with a piece of paper in his hand. It was a list. "These are breathing exercises," he said, his expression serious. "The book says we should practice them together." Anna couldn't help but laugh. The image of her steady, practical husband seriously coaching her through breathing exercises was both touching and comical. But she saw the earnestness in his eyes. This was his way of participating, of helping, of using his craftsman's nature to prepare for something that was ultimately out of his control. So they practiced. They sat on the living room floor, and he would guide her, his voice a calm, steady rhythm. "Breathe in through your nose for 4. Hold for 7, out through your mouth for 8. At first, it felt silly, but soon she found herself sinking into the rhythm, her anxieties melting away under the calm authority of his voice. He was building a scaffold of support for her, one breath at a time. Their intimacy during this final quiet was not about passion, it was about partnership. It was about the unspoken understanding that they were a team, about to face their biggest project together. The physical desire was still there, a low, warm ember, but it was overshadowed by a profound emotional connection, a sense that their souls were perfectly aligned for the task ahead. The night before she went into labor, they were lying in bed, unable to sleep. The baby was active, a series of bumps and rolls rippling across her stomach. Michael had his hand on her belly, his face a mask of awe in the dim light. "Are you scared?" she whispered. He was quiet for a moment, his thumb stroking a slow circle on her skin. "No," he said, and his voice was full of a surprising certainty. "I used to be scared of everything. Scared of breaking things, scared of not being enough. But you taught me how to hold things without breaking them." He looked at her, his eyes shining. "I'm not scared. I'm just ready to meet the person we made." In that moment, Anna felt a profound peace settle over her. The man beside her, who had once been a stranger in his own marriage, was now her anchor, her partner, her rock. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was full. Full of love, full of trust, and full of the quiet, powerful strength of two people who had learned to build a life and a family with their own two hands. They were ready. Chapter 15. The Craftsman's Strength. Labor began not with a dramatic rush, but with a quiet, insistent ache in the deep of the night. It was a slow build, a gathering tide, and through it all, Michael was a calm, unwavering presence. The man who had once been defined by his hesitation was now a study in quiet, focused action. He timed the contractions, his voice a steady metronome in the quiet room. He helped her breathe through each wave, his hand a firm, grounding pressure on her lower back. The breathing exercises they had practiced, which had once seemed so abstract, were now their lifeline. When a contraction would build, Anna would feel a rising panic, a sense of being overwhelmed by the sheer, primal power of it. But then Michael's voice would cut through the haze. "Okay, Anna. Look at me. Breathe with me. In 2, 3, 4. He would breathe with her, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with hers, his eyes locked on hers. He was her anchor in a raging sea. At the hospital, the clinical efficiency of the environment threatened to overwhelm her. The bright lights, the beeping machines, the unfamiliar faces. It was all so different from the safe, quiet world they had built. But Michael created a bubble of calm around her. He spoke to the nurses in a low, respectful tone, advocating for her wishes, but his focus never left her. During the most intense hours of labor, when Anna felt she was losing herself to the pain, his touch was her only reality. He held her hand, his grip strong and sure. He wiped her brow with a cool cloth. He whispered words of encouragement in her ear, not empty platitudes, but words that were real and true. "You are the strongest person I know, Anna. You are doing this. You are bringing our baby into the world." There was a moment, deep into the transition phase, when she felt she couldn't go on. The pain was all-consuming, and she was utterly exhausted. She turned to him, her eyes wide with desperation. "I can't," she gasped, the words torn from her. "I can't do this." Michael's face was a mask of fierce, loving determination. He leaned in close, his forehead pressed against hers. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice a low, powerful command. "You are not alone. I am right here. Feel my hand? I am right here with you. We are doing this together." In that moment, he was no longer the hesitant man she had married. He was her partner in the truest sense of the word. He was taking on her pain, her fear, and reflecting back only strength and love. He was the craftsman, not working with wood, but with her spirit, finding the cracks and the stress points and reinforcing them with his unwavering belief in her. When the time finally came to push, he was there, holding her leg, his body a solid, unmoving support. He was her rock, her foundation. And when their daughter was finally born, a messy, beautiful miracle with a full head of dark hair, the sound of her first cry filled the room, and the world seemed to shift on its axis. The nurse placed the baby on Anna's chest, and she looked down at this tiny, perfect creature, her heart exploding with a love so immense it was almost painful. She was exhausted, spent, but she had never felt more alive. She looked up at Michael. He was openly weeping, tears streaming down his face without shame or reservation. He was looking at his daughter, then at Anna, then back again, his face a portrait of pure, unadulterated awe. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and touched the baby's cheek with the tip of one finger. It was the touch of a master craftsman greeting his most precious creation. He then leaned down and kissed Anna, a kiss that was salty with tears and full of a reverence that eclipsed everything that had come before. It was a kiss that said, "Look what we made. Look what you did." The silence was finally, irrevocably gone. In its place was the beautiful, chaotic, and perfect sound of their family. Chapter 16. the weight of a hand. The first few days of their daughter's life were a blur of exhaustion, adrenaline, and a love so overwhelming it felt like a physical presence in the room. They named her Claire, a name that meant clear and bright, a perfect reflection of the light she had brought into their world. Bringing her home was both terrifying and miraculous. The house, which had once felt so defined by its quiet spaces, was now filled with a new landscape of sounds: the baby's tiny, bird-like cries, the soft whoosh of the rocking chair, and the low, constant murmur of Michael's voice as he spoke to his daughter. Anna, recovering from the marathon of childbirth, spent most of her time in bed or on the couch, with Claire nestled against her chest. She watched Michael navigate the uncharted territory of fatherhood, and her heart felt like it might burst with love. The man who had once been afraid to touch his own wife now moved with an innate, gentle confidence. He learned to change a diaper with the same focused precision he used to set a dovetail joint. He could swaddle Claire into a snug, perfect bundle, his craftsman's hands knowing just the right amount of tension and security. But it was the way he held her that undid Anna completely. He would sit for hours in the rocking chair, Claire asleep on his chest, his large hand spread protectively over her tiny back. It was a gesture of such profound, instinctual fatherhood. That hand, which he had once believed to be clumsy and harsh, was now the safest place in the world for his daughter. He would study her tiny face, his expression a mixture of awe and a fierce, primal love. One afternoon, Anna woke from a much-needed nap to find Michael standing by the window, Claire held securely in his arms. He was showing her the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves of the oak tree outside. "See that, little one?" he was whispering. "That's called dappled light. It's my favorite kind. It reminds me of the way the grain in a piece of wood can tell a story." Anna lay still, listening, her heart aching with the beauty of the moment. He wasn't just caring for his daughter, he was sharing his world with her, translating his passions into a language a newborn could understand through the simple, loving rumble of his voice. Later that evening, Anna was struggling. Claire was fussy and wouldn't settle, and Anna's own exhaustion had reached a breaking point. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. She felt overwhelmed, touched out, and like she was failing. Michael came into the room, took one look at her face, and wordlessly took the baby from her arms. "Go," he said gently. "Take a bath. A long one. I've got her." Anna hesitated, the guilt of leaving her crying baby warring with her desperate need for a moment of peace. "Anna," he said, his voice firm but kind. He met her eyes, and in his gaze, she saw not judgment, but a deep, unwavering partnership. "We're a team. Go." She went. She soaked in the hot water, the scent of lavender filling the air, and for the first time in days, her tense muscles began to relax. She could still hear Claire's cries, but they were interspersed with the low, calming murmur of Michael's voice, a steady, reassuring counterpoint. By the time she got out of the bath, the crying had stopped. She crept to the doorway of the bedroom and peeked in. Michael was sitting in the rocking chair, Claire fast asleep on his chest, his hand resting over her back. He was asleep too, his head tilted back, his face peaceful in the dim light. They were a perfect, self-contained portrait of fatherly love. In that moment, Anna knew that her old fears were gone forever. The silence had been filled, not just with a baby's cries, but with a man's quiet, confident, and boundless love. Chapter 17. A different kind of quiet. The house settled into a new kind of quiet. It was no longer the empty, aching silence of the past, but a living, breathing quiet, full of the soft sounds of a sleeping baby and the unspoken communication of two people who were now a family. The first few weeks of sleepless nights and endless feedings had been a whirlwind, but as Claire began to settle into a more predictable rhythm, Anna and Michael found themselves navigating a new landscape of intimacy. The passionate, exploratory nights they had discovered before the pregnancy were now a distant memory, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. There were moments when Anna would look at Michael across the room and feel a familiar flicker of desire, but it was quickly overshadowed by the sheer, overwhelming need for sleep. She felt a pang of guilt, a worry that the beautiful physical connection they had fought so hard to build was being lost to the practical demands of parenthood. One evening, after a particularly long day, they finally got Claire to sleep in her cradle. They collapsed onto the couch, side by side, not touching, just existing in the shared space of their fatigue. The silence stretched, and for a moment, It felt like the old silence, the one filled with distance. Then, Michael reached over and took her hand. He didn't try to pull her closer or initiate a kiss. He just held it, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in that familiar, comforting way. "I miss you," he said softly, his gaze on their joined hands. The words were a perfect echo of what was in her own heart. "I miss you too," she whispered, her voice thick. "I feel like all I am right now is a mother. I've forgotten how to be a wife. How to be me." He turned to look at her, his eyes full of a deep, knowing empathy. "I know. But Anna," he said, his voice earnest, "when I look at you, I don't just see a mother. I see the woman who taught me how to feel. I see the woman who is tired and covered in spit-up, and you have never been more beautiful to me." He lifted her hand and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. "This is just a different season for us. The intimacy isn't gone. It just looks different right now." His words were a profound gift. He had seen her insecurity and met it with unwavering reassurance. He wasn't demanding a return to the passion of before, he was honoring the new, deeper intimacy they were building in the trenches of new parenthood. From that night on, they began to find their connection in the small moments. It was in the way he would bring her a glass of water without her asking while she was nursing Claire. It was in the way she would gently massage the tension from his shoulders after he'd spent an hour walking a fussy baby around the house. It was a shared look of pure love over their daughter's sleeping head. It was a quick, stolen kiss in the kitchen, a promise of a time when they would have more energy for each other. Their love was no longer a roaring fire, it was a bed of warm, glowing embers, providing a steady, constant heat that warmed them through the long nights. They learned that intimacy wasn't just about what happened in the bedroom. It was about partnership. It was about shouldering a shared burden and finding joy in the shared triumphs. It was about the simple, profound act of two people choosing to see each other, truly see each other, even when they were too tired to keep their eyes open. It was a different kind of quiet, a different kind of touch, and it was, in its own way, the most beautiful and intimate season of their lives. Chapter 18, Stories in the Wood. As Claire grew from a sleepy newborn into a curious, babbling infant, the world of Michael's workshop became her first playground. Anna would bring her out in a small bouncer, placing her in a sunny spot free of sawdust, and Claire would watch, mesmerized, as her father worked. The sounds of the workshop, the rhythmic scrape of a hand plane, the gentle tap of a mallet, the low hum of the lathe, became the soundtrack to her earliest days. Michael, in turn, seemed to draw a new kind of inspiration from his tiny audience. His work took on a softer, more playful quality. He started carving small wooden animals for her, each one sanded so perfectly smooth that it felt like a warm stone in the palm of your hand. There was a fat, happy bear made of dark walnut, a sleek little fox carved from reddish cherry wood, and a family of tiny birds made from pale, creamy maple. He wasn't just making toys, he was crafting a tangible legacy of his love. Each piece was a story, a silent testament to the man he had become. Anna would watch him, his large hands so incredibly gentle as he carved the delicate ear of a rabbit, and she would marvel at the journey he had taken. The fear was completely gone, replaced by a deep, instinctual tenderness. One Saturday afternoon, Michael was working on a special project. He had salvaged a large, beautiful piece of oak from a centuries-old barn that had been torn down. He told Anna he was making a toy chest for Claire, something that would last a lifetime, something that could be passed down. Anna sat with Claire on a blanket on the floor, watching him. He was not just building a box, he was telling their story in the wood. He carved intricate panels for the sides of the chest. The first panel depicted a forest, with tall, silent trees, a nod to his own quiet, solitary beginning. The second panel showed a pair of hands, one large and one small, working with a loaf of bread on a kitchen counter. The third panel showed a cradle, with a tiny, perfect leaf budding on the headboard. And the final panel, the one he was working on now, showed a family of three, a man, a woman, and a child, standing under the spreading branches of a great oak tree. Tears streamed down Anna's face as she watched him work, her heart full to bursting. He had taken his past, his silence, his fear, and their shared journey of healing and discovery, and he had transformed it into a work of art, a story their daughter would be able to touch and feel long after the words had faded. When he was finished, he ran his hand over the final panel, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. He looked over at Anna and Claire, his gaze soft. "Every piece of wood has a story," he said, his voice husky. "I just wanted her to know ours." That evening, after Claire was asleep, they sat together in the workshop, the finished toy chest standing between them like a beautiful, wooden promise. The scent of oak and oil filled the air. Michael reached for Anna's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" she asked, confused. "For not giving up on me," he said, his eyes shining in the dim light. "For seeing the story in the wood, even when I couldn't." Anna leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart settling into a deep, peaceful rhythm. The silence in the workshop was no longer a refuge for a man afraid of the world. It was a studio, a gallery, a sanctuary where a family's love story was carved into something real and lasting. The craftsman had not just restored old furniture, he had restored himself, and in doing so, had built a future more beautiful than any antique. Chapter 19. The Full Circle. On the morning of Claire's first birthday, Anna woke to the smell of baking bread. She smiled, a deep, contented warmth spreading through her chest. It was a smell that was now inextricably linked with the turning point of their lives, the scent of their own quiet revolution. She slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway to the kitchen. Michael stood at the counter, his back to her, his hands covered in flour. He was kneading a loaf of dough with a familiar, rhythmic motion. But this time, it was different. Standing on a small stool beside him, her own tiny hands patting a small lump of dough, was Claire. Her face was a mess of flour, her dark hair sticking up in adorable tufts, and she was giggling, a sound like tiny bells. "Push and fold, little one," Michael was saying, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Just like this. We have to listen to the dough. Feel what it needs." He guided her tiny hands with his own, the same way he had once guided Anna's. His touch was infinitely patient, his movements slow and deliberate to match her clumsy efforts. Anna stood in the doorway, unseen, and watched them, her heart feeling too big for her body. The scene was a perfect, beautiful echo of that day in the kitchen, but this time, it was not born of tension and unspoken frustration. It was born of pure, unadulterated love and joy. It was the full circle. He looked up then and saw her. A slow, warm smile spread across his face. He didn't say a word. He just opened his arm in a silent invitation. Anna walked over and slid into the space beside him, wrapping her arm around his waist. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and the three of them stood there for a moment, a messy, flower-dusted, and utterly perfect family. Later that day, their small house was filled with the happy chaos of a first birthday party. Friends and family gathered, their laughter and conversation filling the rooms that had once been so silent. Michael moved through the crowd with an easy, quiet confidence, Claire perched on his hip. He was no longer the man who stood on the sidelines. He was the calm, steady center of his family's world. Anna watched him from across the room as he spoke with her father. He had one hand on Claire's back, a constant, reassuring presence. At one point, he reached out and squeezed Anna's father's shoulder in a gesture of easy camaraderie. It was a simple touch, one that most people wouldn't even notice. But to Anna, it was everything. It was the language he was now fluent in, a language of connection, of confidence, of love. As the party wound down and the last of the guests departed, Anna found Michael in the living room, standing in front of the toy chest he had built. Claire was asleep in her crib, the house once again settled into its peaceful evening quiet. "It was a good day," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "It was the best day," he replied, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her close. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking at the carved panels that told their story. "Do you remember that first night?" Anna whispered. "In the kitchen? How scared and angry I was." "I remember," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I remember thinking you were the most beautiful, terrifying thing I had ever seen. I wanted to touch you so badly, but I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff." She turned in his arms to face him. "And now?" He smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He lifted his hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin with a familiar, loving reverence. "Now," he said, "it feels like coming home." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that held no memory of hesitation or fear. It was a kiss that tasted of bread and birthdays, and a love that had been patiently, beautifully, and finally completely restored. Chapter 20. The Craftsman's Legacy. Years passed, flowing by with the steady, quiet rhythm of a river. Their house, once a silent vessel for two lonely souls, became a home in the truest sense of the word, filled with the echoes of Claire's laughter, the scent of Michael's workshop, and the constant, steady hum of a deep and abiding love. Claire grew into a little girl with her father's thoughtful eyes and her mother's easy smile. She was a child of both worlds. She loved the stories in Anna's books, but she was most at home in the workshop, her small hands learning the language of wood and grain under her father's patient guidance. Michael taught her not just how to build, but how to listen, how to feel the story in a piece of wood, how to mend what was broken with both strength and gentleness. Their intimacy did not fade with time, it deepened, evolving into something as comfortable and essential as breathing. It was in the shared glance across a dinner table, the casual touch as they passed in the hallway, the way his hand would always find hers in the dark of a movie theater. The fiery passion of their rediscovery had settled into a profound and constant warmth, a hearth they had built together that would never go cold. One crisp autumn afternoon, when Claire was 7, Anna found Michael in his workshop. He was restoring an old, battered writing desk, its surface covered in the scars and ink stains of a long life. Claire sat on a stool beside him, carefully sanding a small, detached drawer, her small face a mask of concentration. Anna leaned against the doorframe, watching them. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the floating dust motes like tiny golden stars. The scene was a perfect, living portrait of everything she had ever hoped for. Michael looked up, as if sensing her presence, and his eyes met hers. In that single look, a decade of shared life passed between them, the painful silence, the night in the kitchen, the first tentative touches, the birth of their daughter, the thousands of small, ordinary moments that had woven the strong, beautiful fabric of their family. His look held no trace of the haunted man he once was. It was filled with a deep, peaceful gratitude. Later that night, after Claire was asleep, they sat on the back porch, wrapped in a shared blanket against the evening chill. The stars were brilliant in the clear, dark sky. "I was thinking today," Anna said softly, her head resting on his shoulder. "About that first year. About how lonely I was. It feels like a story about two different people." Michael was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her. "In a way it was," he said, his voice thoughtful. "That man. He didn't know that love wasn't about being perfect. He thought it was about not making a mark, not leaving a scratch." He paused, and she felt him press a soft kiss to the top of her head. "You taught me that love is about the marks we leave on each other. The good ones. The ones that tell our story." She lifted her head and looked at him, at the handsome face now etched with the fine lines of laughter and time, at the hands that had built her world. "I love our story," she whispered. "Me too," he replied. Their marriage had not begun with passionate kisses or intense nights. It had been born in a profound silence. But it was not the silence that defined them. It was what came after, the patience to listen, the courage to learn a new language, and the simple daily choice to reach out and touch. It was the story of a craftsman who, in learning to love his wife, had finally restored himself, leaving behind a legacy not of perfect, untouched antiques, but of a love that was real, lasting, and beautifully marked by a life fully lived. The end.